Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for turning out. Welcome to our Smoky Nightclub. We're very glad you're here and that you were able to make it for this event. I'm Joe Barr. I'm Chief Content Officer for Capital Public Radio, and we're the NPR station for Northern California, the Central Valley, and Western Nevada, and we're home to PolitiFact California. So we have a great panel of city leaders who are assembled for you this afternoon, and they're discussing one of the most urgent topics facing our state right now. This event is part of the California Dream Project, and it's a journalism collaboration of Cap Radio and CalMatters here in Sacramento, and KQED in San Francisco, KPCC in Los Angeles, and KPBS in San Diego. Our reporting focuses on issues of economic opportunity, quality of life, and the future of the California dream. Our stories appear on the platforms of all the collaborating organizations, online, on radio, on TV, as well as in partner newspapers around California and on National Public Radio. So one reminder before we start, turn off those phones or silence them. Thank you very much. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to Dave Lesher, the editor and CEO of CalMatters.
Thank you very much, Joe. I'll be quick. I want to thank you all for coming, and definitely thank our mayors and panelists for joining us here today. CalMatters is part of the future of journalism. We are 3 years old, a nonprofit. If you don't know us, we have a staff that covers all the issues in the state at the state level, and we share our work statewide with newspaper and radio. We're very happy to be hosting this event today with Cap Radio, and as part of the California Dream Project. We're going to talk about at a time when we're telling people to be indoors. We're going to talk about, the people who don't have indoors. So a very important conversation and very poignant today for health reasons, severe health reasons. We are also live streaming this event, so this is being seen statewide. It's also being recorded, and it will be shared and broadcast on public radio stations statewide in the coming days. So with that, I want to get right to the event and introduce Laurel Rosenhall, who's going to be our moderator today. Laurel came to CalMatters a little over 3 years ago. She was our first reporter hired. She covers the Capitol and especially focus on how the Capitol works and the issues going through the Capitol in real time. She came to CalMatters from the Sacramento Bee, where she also covered state government. So please welcome Laurel Rosenhall.
Thanks to all of you for being here. We all know that homelessness is a growing issue throughout our state and is frankly at a crisis level in many California cities. On any given night, more than 130,000 Californians go to sleep without a home. And the vast majority of them are not sheltered at all. They're sleeping on our streets and doorways and riverbanks and under freeways. So we're here today to hear about what some of California's major cities are doing to provide shelter and services for their neediest residents. We'll talk a bit about the impact of the recent election and look ahead to what to expect in the coming year. I'll ask questions of the mayors. I encourage you to also question each other or dialogue among yourselves. And then we will get to questions from all of you. You should have comment cards. We'll come around and collect those and take your questions toward the end of the discussion. And now I will introduce the mayors. We have, starting from my right, San Diego Mayor Kevin Faulconer, Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti, Oakland Mayor Libby Schaaf, and Sacramento Mayor Darrell Steinberg. So to begin with, I'd like to ask each of you to talk about sort of the scope of homelessness in your city and what you're doing to make things better. We know that though homelessness is common throughout cities, solutions in each city look a little different. And maybe Mayor Schaaf, you could start off by talking about the Tough Sheds communities and other things you're doing in Oakland.
Sure. Oakland, like many cities, have seen a huge increase in homelessness. Our last point in time count, which is almost 2 years old now, showed just under 2,000 people sleeping on the streets, unsheltered, every night. with another just under 400 that were homeless but sheltered. And we have, I'd say the most creative thing we've done, I would say there are two things that we've done that are creative. Obviously, we know that the permanent solution to homelessness is housing, more affordable housing. And I'm sure you'll hear us all talk about what we think needs to change in state government to really expedite that. But in the meantime, we're mayors. Even though when I came to local government years ago, I was told that homelessness was the responsibility of the county government, I am not seeing the county government solve the problem of what I see on my streets every night. And I want to credit our partnerships with philanthropy, with even the private sector, with local companies that have stepped in and allowed us to experiment with things in a way that government is not always designed to engage in risk-taking. But as I said to my city staff, who laid out all the risks involved in trying these tough shed cabin communities, that the biggest risk is doing nothing at all.
Can you explain it a little bit? Because people might not be familiar with what it is.
Sure. The idea started a couple winters ago when I was shocked to find out that every night our traditional shelter had empty beds in it. In fact, I was informed this morning that our shelter had 20 empty beds last night in the middle of an air quality crisis. 20 empty beds in my shelter last night. Trust me, I will have an answer as to why that was the case by the time I get out of here. But that led us to ask, why are people not choosing shelters? And so we came up with this idea, and I want to say it was inspired by something done in Yolo County. We all do talk to each other and compare notes. We set up these cabin communities. They have 20 small structures. They are tough sheds, but they are made out of housing, building materials. They are big enough to house 2 beds with a curtain between for privacy if the people are roommates as opposed to partners. They have double-paned windows, so they are very quiet when closed. And we put in insulation, and the door locks, and only the resident has that key. The communities themselves, again, 40 people to a community. They also have 2 full-time housing navigators on site. We give 2 meals a day. We have a dog run. We provide dog food. And there is overnight security. And we have found that by locating these next to an encampment, an existing encampment, we allow that encampment to move as a community into one of these cabin communities so that they can stay together. It also is part of our deal with the surrounding neighborhood that while they will have a tough shed cabin community in their neighborhood, it will be actually resolving and upgrading the conditions of an encampment that was in their neighborhood. The invitation area for the tough shed cabin communities then becomes a no camping zone. So we do work very gently and thoughtfully with the community to transition them into the community. But at some point, we do say, unless you take our offer of shelter in the cabin community or at our traditional shelter, you will have to leave this area.
Okay, thank you. Mayor Garcetti, do you want to talk about what's going on in Los Angeles?
Sure. Thank you all for being here today, and thank you to my brother and sister mayors for being here. I'm so honored to work with this group, and we're part of a group of, which is right now called the Big 11, but of the 11 most populous city mayors in California, who really do spend a lot of time talking to each other, sharing information, and advocating for a state leadership role instead of just a kind of collective at the local level where sometimes cities and counties do work well together, other times cities and counties don't. Cities and neighboring cities may coordinate or may not. But it's really been, I think, an important voice and the most urgent voice that really did help work with this legislature and Governor Brown to elevate to the state level this, which is the greatest moral and humanitarian crisis the state faces. And in general terms, and I'll get to Los Angeles, I really do think that California's success we brag a lot about, and we should. We have peaks that are unlike any in this country. But I think it's also in our valleys that we judge our success of how well we are doing, to what extent, who are we leaving behind, what are the consequences of just so many people wanting to be in California, and will we build an infrastructure to accommodate them? Because you don't have to be homeless to be dealing with really what this is all about, which is a generalized failure of this state, a failure not just on homelessness, but a failure on child welfare, a failure on criminal justice reforms, a failure on the way that we look at domestic and sexual violence, especially for women, the way that we deal with trauma, and the way we deal with infrastructure. If you really want to simplify homelessness, it's about generally a group of people who are traumatized in different ways and housing being too expensive. In Los Angeles, we're looking at both, and we actually do have a pretty remarkable partnership both between the city of Los Angeles, where we have about 25,000, maybe 23,000 people a night on the street, and about 32,000 overall if you take the sheltered population. It's the most in America. It's not the most per capita, but we're a large city, so it's the fifth largest per capita, so it's right there at the top. And we're also a regional center, so like many of the cities, folks oftentimes in Los Angeles, you're more likely to be from Los Angeles if you're homeless than if you're not. So the myth that people come from Kansas is not necessarily true, but we do have a lot of regional kind of collection of whether people coming out of jail, hospitals, et cetera, that center in our city for the region of Los Angeles and Southern California. We're taking a kind of all the above approach. And thanks to the voters, we passed the two largest measures in US history, one for building housing, supportive housing, and one for services. This is a property tax and this is a sales tax measure. But together for a decade, because they each last 10 years, they'll give us $4.5 billion to really ramp up outreach, mental health, housing navigators, all that kind of work, some direct assistance, and then to build a housing infrastructure for those that are the worst off or the most traumatized and need the deepest care. And after 9 years of increases, this past year as that money started to flow, and really this will be the first honest fiscal year from July 1st of this year till next year to see how these programs work. We saw a first small downturn, which was 6%, nothing to brag about, certainly doesn't look any better on the streets, but it gave us a lot of confidence because there's two measures in a city. When we judge our success in LA, and there's a whole bunch of programs that maybe I'll just feather into our later comments, but you look at how many people in that point in time count there are, but you also have to look at how many solutions a year you're coming up with, because that really shows the progress of, is the machine to house people and to solve homelessness getting better? In Los Angeles, when I started, it was about 8,800 people a year, the first year after we dug into this, which was a new peak. Every year it's gone up, and this past year we housed 16,500 people in some sort of permanent housing solutions. We probably, that means, have a supply of close to that, right? Maybe 15,000 new people a year. So one of the things increasingly that I hope we can also bring into this conversation is what are we doing on prevention? Because it really, the longer I spend on this issue, the more this is everything. We will be building 10,000 units of supportive housing from the bond and other things that we will leverage. We've passed a linkage fee to build more affordable housing, which should give us about $100 million a year. We want redevelopment back, or however we want to talk about tax increment financing from the state. We all lobbied for the HEAP dollars, which is the state money that's come in. We're putting 45 million of that to work in what Libby was talking about. We had a lot of permanent supportive housing coming, but that takes 2 to 3 years to build. More outreach and street services, but it's that encampment problem on the street right now that there was not enough bridge housing. And the old debates of like, you can either be for shelter or for housing, we kind of are saying it's a false dichotomy. We are for both, and you need both. And the tweezer-based approach of taking people who are the most vulnerable and putting them into the permanent supportive housing, which is necessary because they're closest to death, doesn't solve the encampments problem, because you'll take 2 people out of a 20-person encampment, 18 people stay, and 2 more replace them in that coming month.
Can I use that, the tweezer?
Yeah, sure, please, absolutely. I mean, that's what it is. It kind of, in a good way, takes out the worst off folks, but it doesn't solve neighborhood. And this is really, I think, something that is a neighborhood-based issue that all 4 of us confront, because the complaints you get from the most humanitarian people who want to solve homelessness and do whatever they can, to the people who are just like, get rid of these folks, and I had a bad experience with somebody committing some sort of crime who was also experiencing homelessness, and they conflate the two. No matter where they come from, everybody wants a neighborhood-based solution. And most of our homelessness policy is very 50,000 feet or just on the ground, here's a meal. And we need something in between to stabilize trauma and then get people to being case managed, worked towards some solution off the streets, while we wrap around in Los Angeles this prevention picture, which to me, the more I think about it, this is oftentimes just about rent. We could give people $200 or $300 more a month, and we wouldn't be paying $50,000, $60,000, $100,000, $500,000 for a new unit a few years later.
Thank you. Mayor Faulconer?
Good morning. Thank you for having me as well. It is the issue. that we are dealing with in all of our cities. That is the unfortunate reality and a truism. But one, I think, when I look at the work that we have been doing, and there is a lot of collaboration for all of the right reasons. This is not a partisan issue. This is a right thing that we should be doing issue. And I think one of the things that you've heard from some of my colleagues and certainly from myself is the old way of doing things aren't working. And so if we look at what we're seeing and trying to treat people with dignity and respect, but to get results, we have to do things differently than we were doing as cities 10, 15, and 20 years ago. It is an all-of-the-above approach. We have discussions, probably all of us, and should we do this? Should we do it? Yes, yes, yes. Is it housing? Absolutely. Is it services? Absolutely. Is it prevention? Yes. But it's also, and I think, and you'll hear this from from all of us, my colleagues today, because we believe in it. And I've really tried to set that tone in San Diego. It's about action. It's about not waiting, not letting perfect be the enemy of the good, and to take that leadership role in sometimes very difficult decisions that we have to make as mayors, and to try to work with our council members, our neighborhood groups, and others, which is people need help. And we need to give them that help now. Just a couple of examples of what we've been doing in San Diego on our bridge shelters. We got 700 people off the street that we just started just a little over a year ago. The right thing to do. And you get a lot of folks who will say, I support the bridge shelters. I think that's a great idea. It's working. But I just don't want one here, right? And so one of the things that we all deal with in terms of NIMBYism, in terms of folks that want to help people, is to say, this is not something to be feared. This is something that is going to have the desired results that I think all of us want to see. And so when we look at what we've been trying to do on the bridge shelters, what we've been doing in terms of safe parking programs, what we've been doing in terms of a storage center for folks on the street to have a safe place to secure and store their belongings. Again, so if you're going to a job interview later in the day or others, and again, all of these things are not necessarily inexpensive, but as we're trying to set both the tone and the desire of achieving real positive change, it is that all above the approach. And the work that all of us, earlier this year, and we'll talk about it a little bit more, I'm sure, on the HEAP funding in terms of working with the state. The issue of homelessness is absolutely intertwined with our housing supply. We need to build more housing. Yes. We need to build more housing. And that is something that sometimes elected officials were reluctant to say, even a few years ago. And so we've been trying to set the tone. One of the things I've been doing, and we're updating all of our community plans in San Diego with master environmental impact reports, not wanting to get too much in the wonky weeds here, but I think this crowd will understand it. So you can go and build that housing by right, so you don't have to go through endless cycles. That is incredibly important. Eric just talked about redevelopment and tax increment. Bringing that back, ladies and gentlemen, is an absolute essential thing that we need to do it in California. What was our number one source for affordable housing in cities? Those redevelopment funds, those tax increment funds. We have to bring that back. And one more that I will throw out, because I think it's also incredibly important, we're talking big picture, is the issue of CEQA reform. We have to be able to make sure that we have the ability to move forward with building housing and not constantly get embroiled sometimes with lawsuits that make no sense. And so some of those big picture items, I think, as we continue to work together to make some of those changes, not only at the statewide level, but at the local level, and to demonstrate by example and political will when it's not always easy to do, but all of us share the same goal. We need to help people get off the street. We need to help them get off the street now, whether that's into a bridge shelter, but also with one goal, which is to get them into permanent supportive housing so they can stay off the street for good.
Thank you. And Mayor Steinberg, if you could talk about the scope of homelessness in Sacramento, what you're doing, and save your desires for policy changes at the state level till later in the conversation, please.
You knew exactly where I was going to start, too, Laurel. You know me, as I've traversed both the state and local government landscape.
Which do you like better?
Which do I like better? A complete tie. I love them both. So I listen to Mayor Faulconer, and it reminds me, of course, that local government is where partisanship really does not exist, because maybe from different political parties, but I listened to him and I agree with virtually everything he just said about what it is going to take. In Sacramento, we are employing the whatever it takes approach. And the comment that I think it was Mayor Schaaf made, or maybe Mayor Garcetti, about the city and county relationships are really relevant here, if not spoken about as often. The county is the Health and Human Services entity for local government. The cities are where the greatest degree of the problem exists. And so when I became mayor and saw that we had what I would call kind of a ribbon-cutting philosophy in Sacramento. We celebrate the pilots, we celebrate the great nonprofits that are doing the work, but we did not have a real strategy nor an articulated goal around how many people we actually wanted to get off the streets. I came in and I said, with my colleagues, Vice Mayor Hansen and others, that whether we like it or not, we must get in the business with our county to make alleviating homelessness a top-tier priority. And so we applied, because our county did not, for the federal whole person care grant, the federal Medicaid waiver that's given us with our private partner $64 million to actually practice one of the 4 key elements of making this problem better, and that is assertive outreach out on our streets. You're not going to get people who have been on the streets for a decade or more with severe mental illness or substance abuse off the street merely by offering them a voucher or a place in the shelter. Treatment resistance is real, but it's also overstated and overrated, because with the practice of assertive, consistent outreach, remember Steve Lopez and The Soloist and his relationship with Nathaniel Ayers, it works. You can get people into care and treatment if you're assertive and you build that trust between the clinically trained outreach worker and the person on the streets. So we now have that ability in Sacramento, and since May 1st, we've engaged over 700 people on the streets of Sacramento who have enrolled now in whole person care. Secondly, and this is what we fought for at the state level this year under the umbrella of the so-called Big 11.
And under your leadership.
Well, thank you, Libby.
Our chair.
Yes.
Our president.
Well, I appreciate. I just happen to be the guy that is closest to the Capitol. that helps, you know.
It does help.
In many ways.
In many ways, yes. And I still know my way a little bit around there. But anyways, it's triage. You cannot get most people from the streets or the riverbanks into permanent housing without a bridge, because they're not ready and they're going to fail. Housing first, by the way, is not housing only. It's housing combined with services. So all of us in different ways. I love Libby's tough shed approach. I've been to San Diego to look at the sprung shelters. In Sacramento, we have rented a soon-to-be cannabis warehouse facility to house 200 people in our first low-barrier triage center, in which, just as the other cities are doing here, pets, possessions, and partners, we take people where they're at. And as a result, we've brought in over 400 people in a 200-bed facility. And of course, a number of them have left for either transitional or permanent housing. This is essential, and we need to multiply what we're doing in one part of Sacramento, North Sacramento, 5 to 6 to 8 times. Third is mental health and substance abuse resources. This is where the partnership with the county is so key, because they are the recipients of the Mental Health Services Act, the Prop 63 dollars, the act that I was involved in back in 2004. We need this active partnership with the counties because they provide those resources. Fourth is permanent housing. You know which proposition had more votes on the California ballot 2 weeks ago than any other proposition? It was Proposition 2. Sure. It was the No Place Like Home initiative that takes part of the Prop 63 dollars, securitizes it, and creates a $2 billion housing bond. And here's going to be the call to action for the new governor and for the state administration and for all of us. How do we get that money out the door quickly without years of backlog? And finally, I want to emphasize this issue, which I know we'll talk more about prevention and early intervention. Because here's what I can say, and I'm not happy to say this, but this is the truth. I'm actually confident that in my city and throughout the state that we are going to get thousands of people off the streets. I really am. I think with the strategies we are all employing in different ways, we will do this. But I'm less confident about whether or not we have the commitment and the will to prevent the next cohort of tens of thousands of people from becoming homeless. So we may feel good in our hearts, and rightfully so, that we will have helped thousands of people, tens of thousands of people through these efforts. But the real challenge, the additional challenge is, will the people in our communities feel any different as they walk downtown for lunch or go to the park or try to live their lives? That's the real challenge here. And so the paradigm shift as we get to policy needs to be how we have a statewide housing strategy and an emergency assistance approach for people who are on that edge, that proverbial edge, who are one broken down car, one lost job, one rent increase away from no longer being able to afford their tenancy. We can do this, but it's going to take unprecedented level of effort. Finally, I say this. I hope we get to the whole issue of regulatory reform and siting specifically. These horrible wildfires, horrible wildfires. Is there any question that we are going to put up every bit of emergency shelter necessary to house the dispossessed people of Butte County? No. Do you know how long it takes to not only get money out the door for homelessness, but to actually site facilities, especially when a neighbor can sue and hold it up? How long it takes our public works departments to fit all the infrastructure and do all this business? Treat this like a crisis in this state, the crisis that it is, and the policies to make sure that we actually build what is needed to volume and to scale will then follow.
Thank you. That was a great sort of opening remarks to give us all a good sense of the landscape across the state. I want to touch on something a couple of you brought up, which was the tax increase you did in Los Angeles for homeless services, the Prop 2 money that you just mentioned, which is specifically housing for homeless folks who are mentally ill. I know in Oakland, your voters approved a tax increase this month for homeless services. I believe in San Diego, you're considering one for next year. In addition, statewide, the voters approved the Prop 1 housing bond to build affordable housing. So very quickly, I'd like to go down the line and ask each of you, when can we expect to see this money make a difference? When, and please be specific with a year or a number of years, when will the homeless population in your cities decrease?
Do I start?
Yep.
Okay, well, I pledged, and my political consultant said, well, what did you say? That we have to get 2,000 people off the streets over the next 3 years, and that was a year ago. So
2020?
2020, 2,000 people.
A noticeable decrease?
Yes.
Okay. Mayor Schaaf?
Well, first of all, the tax that just passed, we're not going to actually see that money for a long time. It's a very uncertain tax. It's on vacant property, so it's very unknown. I'm not holding my breath over that one, frankly. I can tell you that based on the HEAP funding, cobbling things together, we will within 1 year add either safe parking spaces or new shelter beds, whether they're in a tough shed cabin community, a traditional shelter, or one of our rapid rehousing centers. We've added capacity in all those areas. We will add about 900 more beds. That's basically tripling the supply of emergency beds that we had a year ago. But I'm going to be rude and just answer a question you didn't ask me. How unlike a politician to do that. You all have touched on prevention, and I just want to highlight, we are doing this in Oakland, and it is fabulously successful and cost-effective. And I just want to point out, there is no dedicated governmental funding source to prevent homelessness. It is ridiculous. We had to spend 2 years scraping around and begging philanthropy, which we were successful at doing, and we finally announced about a month ago, Keep Oakland Housed. And this is a 3-pronged approach where we provide emergency financial assistance. Now that may be back rent, but it depends on that household's unique situation about what has caused their risk of losing their house. We provide free legal assistance, and we provide case management to assess the ongoing ability for that household to stay housed. In our first 10 days, we kept 60 families in 10 days from becoming homeless. One of my favorite stories was Deborah Ross. The total cost to keep her housed was $800. Yep. That is all she needed to keep her housing for herself and her grandson. That is the most cost-effective investment that we can make. It is shameful that we do not have dedicated public funding for this.
And so
Let's change that.
Darrell, I have no doubt we will.
That's the boot. Now we're forming the Big 11 agenda here on stage.
Well, and again, thank you, philanthropy, for giving me $9 million to do this and to document and evaluate and demonstrate just how cost-effective this is, so that this then can become a popular agenda that we can sell to the legislature.
Mayor Garcetti, your voters approved this new money a couple years ago, so you've had some time. So, how soon do you think that there will be a noticeable decrease in homelessness?
It's a great question, and respectfully, it's the wrong question. I'll tell you why. Because we don't know what the supply-in will be. If you're going to be responsible and answer that, I've come now after working on this issue since I was 14 years old and as a mayor for the last 5.5 years. You cannot responsibly answer what the net will be if you don't know the supply. I can do what Darrell talked about. I can tell you how many people we will house. I think we'll go from, we used to be 8,800 a year. This past year, 16,500. My gut is that it'll probably be over 20,000 this year, people who are actually housed out of homelessness. But if we don't know what happens with the economy, if we don't know what the criminal justice reforms without a true safety net are going to be, and we have huge supplies of people coming out of prisons and jails, if we don't know what work is being done in child welfare, if we don't know if we're finally winding down a war in Afghanistan and how many vets are going to be coming home, if we don't know what infrastructure is out there for domestic and sexual violence, I can't give you a net number.
Okay.
And so until we approach it that way, I think, and that is the beautiful thing about homelessness. Homelessness is not an issue. It is a prism that refracts everything in our cities, in our societies. And if we're truly interested in ending a condition on our streets because it's either inconvenient, appalling, or morally we don't like it, it requires us to dig deep into multiple policy areas at the same time, which is what's so exciting to me, is that we can do those together.
Mayor Faulconer?
One of the things, just to take off on working particularly with the private sector, I had a goal of getting 1,000 veterans off the street in a year or less. It took us 16 months to do that. But one of the things that we did was we interacted with our landlord community. And I said, I need your help. I need your help for men and women that have served our country, that we're trying to get into housing. And there was a stigma, right, about providing housing to folks that are homeless. And so I said, one of the things that we wanted to do is to be smart about how the resources that we had. And so guaranteeing first month's, last month's extra security deposit to try to help alleviate some of those concerns, because we needed people to actually have a place to go. And the success of that program, as I think in part of the model that we're going to try to do with our entire homeless population, with our landlord community, to say, here, look, there's some financial guarantees, if you will, right? Because a lot of folks are bottom line oriented that own apartments, but also not to fear. Fear is a powerful human emotion. And if we can take away some of that fear by demonstrating how something can actually work, and the number of individuals in that program, in our Housing Our Heroes program, that had problems with some of the units was 4 out of 1,000. And so it's trying the all of the above approach. It's trying to take, in this case, which was literally some extra help in gap dollars that could really get people into a unit. And so as we're moving forward with some of the dollars that are HEAP dollars and others, there is going to be a measure on a future San Diego ballot, a citizens initiative that just qualified for not only expanding our convention center, but about approximately $500 million for homelessness. Let's be smart and targeted with those dollars and put it to use now so we can get people off the street now. And again, into a cycle that's a positive cycle, where you're showing that sometimes just that small amount of dollars can make the difference between able to afford an apartment or not.
So when do you think that the people in your community will see a difference?
Well, hopefully they're seeing a difference now. But I think to what you've heard from all of the mayors, as we tackle this, it's not only helping folks that are on the street, but trying desperately to say, preventing not just additional folks from falling into homelessness. And so how do you do that? You do that by not only some of the temporary emergency issues that we're dealing with, but again, back to some of the permanent solutions to make housing in general more affordable for everybody in our city and more opportunities to be able to move into that housing. If we don't do that, in any of our cities, we won't be successful.
Okay. So getting
jump in on that just for 2 seconds?
Sure.
I think that's the right frame, actually. It's that if we want to see a visual difference, it isn't about whether or not there's a lot of work and activity. We are going to have to scale this up to something that is double or triple the size of even all of our collective efforts.
Okay.
If you're looking at the visual difference of the net coming down, because we've never housed people, I think, as quickly, as aggressively, as comprehensively, as much services, and still it's not enough. I mean, on veterans, I took the pledge, and the reason why I want to dig in, and I said it was a good question, but the wrong one, I've learned that lesson personally as a politician. So at the beginning, Michelle Obama was going around the country asking mayors to end veterans' homelessness. I took that pledge, and many of us probably did. LA by far had the most. I think it was 6,500 vets who were homeless on our streets. And then headlines a couple years later was that LA had failed. Now let me describe what the failure was. We housed 9,000 homeless vets, the most in the country. We put all hands on. We had the VA, we had local government, county, city all together. It was extraordinary. I stood up a new office of Veterans Affairs. We had, by pure numbers, the greatest success in the country, but we have 2,000 left. So in other words, from that 6,500, there was a new 5,000 who have become homeless. And people said, you have failed. I don't mind that because we run for office, we're used to criticism. But what it did is it took the air out of the balloon of people thinking we can make a difference here. And so I think it's really important for our reporting on this because I don't always get that nuance. It's not a complaint, but I told its main homelessness reporter in Los Angeles said, you have to tell some good news stories or people will say, this is unsolvable, sweep them out, or whatever it is, or we'll give up on this. When there actually is a lot of momentum of real people, real stories, real successes, at the same time we have to say, and let's double it. Not say you guys failed, because I guarantee you the next crop of mayors, if the stamp is failure on everybody, will say, I'm not touching homelessness.
Okay. So getting the money is one hurdle and spending it is another. As we've seen in Los Angeles, where your voters did pass this tax increase, now you're having a really hard time getting people to agree to have shelters put in their neighborhoods. And I know there's been some pretty raucous public meetings. You've been booed. You're getting a lot of pushback. And Mayor Steinberg, this is an issue you're going to be facing really soon. You've said you're going to announce new shelter locations next month for Sacramento. So I was wondering, Mayor Garcetti, do you have any advice for Mayor Steinberg on this?
Sure. Darrell. So where do I start? No, again, I think it's overreported because it's so much easier to report the opposition than the ones that have no opposition. Like, that's never an article. And I would say that we've done polling on this. 60 to 70% of people consistently say yes to supportive housing in their neighborhood, right by them, and now the bridge housing shelters. So can you get a community meeting? Like we had one in Venice, California. We had about 400 people in support of doing something at a bus yard. They didn't get there as early as the 300 people who were opposed to it and who were kind of indoors. And it was the most raucous public meeting of my life. 4.5 hours of, like, as my council member, Mike Bonin, was describing who some of these people were. Somebody actually yelled, don't humanize this. We had the chief of police there with a badge and a gun who got a little bit more respect because of those two things. But people just interrupting, yelling. It's kind of the death of civil discourse in America embodied at its highest. But it was a great meeting, too. A lot of people said afterwards,
that sounds like it.
Do you regret it? And I stayed there for 4.5 hours until because after 2.5 hours we stopped and the news cameras went away. People were a little bit more civil, interestingly, when those were gone. And they said, "You're leaving." I said, "Nope, I'm not going to leave till every single one of you who wants to talk to me can talk to me." And me and the council member stood for another 2 hours, I'd say, or an hour and a half, until we looked around and nobody was left in the room. We outlasted every person in the room. We can't get 100% agreement on anything, but it was really necessary to hear that. So I would do some of that, but I also tell elected officials, don't process these things to death, because when they open,
Can't wait.
to your point, it becomes a person. Oh, I thought it was going to be bad having vets in my apartment, and 4 out of 1,000 is probably a better rate than folks who aren't homeless being tenants in general, if you're a landlord. So do the minimum, and I don't mean that in a superficial way, but yes, listen to people, but do something. Actually build it, open it up, and then I think it changes the conversation. And for us, we have about 40 sites we're looking at simultaneously. Most don't have anywhere near that level of opposition. We had protests about one, and we moved it 3 blocks away, and everybody said, "Great, we want it there." So it wasn't that the neighborhood didn't want it. And the last piece is listen to people's fears. Opponents, some are against homeless individuals, people who are experiencing homelessness, but most are usually experiencing something else, either about public safety or cleanliness. And it doesn't mean that they're wrong because they're yelling and conflating that with homelessness. So at that meeting in Venice, for instance, it was clear we needed some more police resources for whether it was somebody who was homeless or not committing criminal acts. And everybody feels a little bit more satisfied that they were listened to by government, and it isn't just about whether they oppose or favor a shelter.
And I'll add, we've had an interesting experience by using this geographic approach. So with the Tough Shed Cabin communities, they're small, but the deal is you get one in your neighborhood, but it serves the homeless that were already in that neighborhood.
Yep.
So again, the neighbors have actually become huge fans, and we bring them to the next neighborhood to actually give testimony of just how much it improved their quality of life. And then the other thing about our Tough Shed Cabin communities is we are actually about to decommission the first one because we only were able to get an 18-month lease on that piece of property. So we often find pieces of property that are about to be developed, and we have permission to be there. I mean, our minimum length of stay is 18 months, but the idea that this actually might go away someday has also been a selling point now. We're replacing it fourfold somewhere else, but that has also helped the conversation. But at the end of the day, and I mean, we all know this, we signed up to be unpopular, right? in a weird way, right? And so I always say, like, to the council member, just say like it's the mayor's fault. I'm the one who's making it happen. You hear them, and you've tried your best to advocate for them, and it's the damn mayor.
So yes, I agree with that. I mean, I think a couple elements.
Can I say that in LA about the Oakland mayor? Or
Please.
I just always say it's Darrell's fault.
Say it's my fault. It is. It's a combination of all the above. You have to do what Mayor Garcetti described in Venice, right? You have to engage with the people in the community, and you have to listen, and you have to listen endlessly. But you also can't take no for an answer when you know you've got an obligation here, and that's where the will of a mayor and the willingness to be a little bit unpopular. I say as we begin developing our fair share policy in Sacramento, that it's okay if everyone's a little bit mad, as opposed to one community being horribly mad because it's all there. And what we found in North Sacramento with our Railroad Avenue shelter is that the fury died down as soon as they saw that what came with the shelter, by the way, were additional resources for neighborhood cleanup, for law enforcement, and a lot of the surrounding area actually got better as a result. Yep. So proving concept, of course, is crucial. But in the end, it does take a large amount of will and political will to say that no matter how much one fears the placement of a homeless triage center, for example, it is better than the status quo, because the status quo is unacceptable. And by the way, homelessness is no longer just a downtown issue anymore. It spreads throughout our entire community, and everyone's affected.
So there was an interesting ruling from the Ninth Circuit this fall in what's called the Boise case. It obviously comes out of Idaho, but it affects all the states in the Ninth Circuit, including California. that basically says prosecuting people for sleeping on the streets is a type of cruel and unusual punishment that violates the Constitution. The judges wrote that as long as there's no option of sleeping indoors, the government cannot criminalize indigent homeless people for sleeping outdoors on public property on the false premise that they had a choice in the matter. And I'd like each of you to say what this decision means for your city, maybe starting with Mayor Faulconer. You faced a lot of criticism in 2017 for conditions that festered for a long time that contributed to a hepatitis outbreak that eventually killed 20 people. You then began disrupting unauthorized homeless camps and said that San Diego, quote, will no longer tolerate the use of a sidewalk, a riverbed, or a tarp as a home. So I'm just wondering, is this a practice that you can continue under the Boise ruling?
Yeah, it's really about an unsafe, unsanitary environment. It's not something that anyone should be forced into sleeping in at night or during the day. And in fact, when we talk about, like for example in San Diego, our homeless outreach teams from our police department, it is always the offer of, we have a bed for you tonight. That's the first thing that when we're going out there and talking to folks is not from an enforcement standpoint, it's how can we help you tonight? And that is obviously incredibly important because there's one goal. It's not about arresting people, it's about getting people help. And so that's been the approach that we've been taking. And at the same time, not only just by the way in our in streets and in sidewalks, but particularly also in our canyons. And in our San Diego River, it has everything to do with you cannot allow unsanitary and unclean conditions that affect your water quality and other issues. We're very serious about that. We're very serious about saying there is a place to go. Now, it's incumbent upon us to provide those opportunities, right? In the midst of opposition, in the midst of, yes, I do not want individuals on the sidewalks and the streets, what folks will say, or in our canyons. And then we get pushback when we say, okay, well, we're going to open a bridge shelter here, we're going to do that there. But that has always been the approach that I've taken, and I've also said that for too long, elected officials, and I said this, including myself, have waited for universal consensus on this issue that doesn't exist. If you're going to wait for universal consensus, we're all going to be waiting, and that gets back to the issue of being bold, being innovative, not being afraid to take some of the heat. But then backing it up, particularly we were talking about the storage center that we started in San Diego. A lot of fear about what's going to happen to the neighborhood if we start this. And what I said is, the neighborhood will be cleaner. You will see a marked difference. You're going to help people that need this facility, and you have to trust some of that. But trust is believing when you actually open it.
Okay.
And if we opened it and it wasn't working, we weren't going to have the results that we have, but you have to be able to cut through that and to say, take the chance and make sure you're doing a difference. And with that approach, then we're able to do more. And that's why I said that action-oriented is one of the things that I think is helping us in San Diego.
But on the criminalization issue, did your city change practices after this ruling came out in September?
We've always, for the last several years, we've always had that same approach, which is,
so no
here's what we
change.
do. The offer is services.
What about the others? Did you change things after the ruling?
We've used our camping ordinance in a very limited way. Look, while the Boise decision has caused a lot of consternation among local governments, in my opinion, it's actually very logical. It is a call and a cry for the state, for the cities, and the counties to build more shelter and to be able to offer a shelter bed to someone, which is our practice and policy as well, before you would consider citing someone. And that's logical.
So have you made a change since this ruling?
We are rarely using, if ever, the camping ordinance. Where we break up campsites now, it's based on public health. It's based upon obstruction of the sidewalks. It's based upon other grounds.
And so you're not prosecuting those people? Is that the difference?
We're not prosecuting people in the camping ordinance.
What about the other cities?
No change in how we're acting. But I guess my frustration is the case created, I think, some confusion and an impression that the city could not do anything. And so it has kind of emboldened the advocacy community to kind of take the position that we don't ever have the right to move anyone against their will. And that is not what that case says. The
Yup.
case recognizes that cities do have public health concerns. We have a federal obligation to keep sidewalks clear for disabled community under the ADA. We have other vulnerable communities that are sometimes in conflict with our unsheltered residents.
So you're saying moving people elsewhere or moving them along is frequently the cliche is different than prosecuting and criminalizing.
Correct, particularly when you have an articulated public policy reason.
Okay.
You're not criminalizing them, but you are requiring
Okay.
them to relocate, and you are offering them shelter.
Mayor Garcetti, has you changed?
No change. We already had basically a ruling that applied to the city of Los Angeles that was similar to Boise. So overnight sleeping and people, no. Possessions and daytime right-of-way, yes, but we don't criminalize that. We've been very clear that, and working with advocates to hopefully not have this lawsuit back and forth. I've been sitting down saying, just first premise, do you believe that we should be able to clear and clean during the daytime, whatever prescribed hours? If yes, help us write it. So you don't have to just wait for us, react to it, and sue us,
Okay.
and be lost for 5 or 6 years of momentum where nobody's helped at all.
I'd like to remind everyone to complete your question cards if you have something to ask, and we'll be coming around in a little bit to collect those. One very small slice, but very visible slice of the homeless population, they're the people who use a disproportionate amount of public services with many trips to jails and emergency rooms due to mental health and addiction problems. Jerry Brown signed a controversial law this year that allows 3 counties, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and San Diego, to basically force these people into treatment through a process called conservatorship. Counties would have to prove that they could provide housing and wraparound services before they participate, but then they can conserve people, individuals with serious mental illness and substance abuse disorders who have been detained by police and refused treatment. And so I'm just wondering, for the 2 relevant mayors here, Garcetti and Faulconer, do you have any intentions to use this new procedure?
Well, it will sometimes be us, but it'll mostly be the counties, and I believe that there is that intention, of course. And the reason I think the county supported it in Los Angeles. We all know these cases, if you just want to humanize, it's the person who, right now the standard is you have to immediately be harming yourself or somebody else. Otherwise, you can be that person on that bus bench for, as I know one woman was like for 5 months there, just kind of sitting and rotting away. And and clearly, deeply mentally ill, dealing with demons, we can all see it, but we're powerless. And in those cases, yes. And I do think, the reaction to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is now, 50 years later, still, don't ever do anything because you might be putting somebody in some sort of institution who doesn't have, because of your opinion, true mental health issues. We know that there are some that I think we could get pretty close to 100% support in this room, or any reasonable person. And I think this gives those counties the tools. It shouldn't be police making those determinations.
How many people do you think it will be in LA?
No idea.
Okay. What about in San Diego?
Yeah, we're at the very beginning of those conversations. In fact, our County Board of Supervisors just held a session on behavioral health, mental health that I attended. And what is the right balance, I think, is what it comes down to. We all know the need, and we see, fortunately, voters supported when it came to Proposition 2 for the housing element, and to get that going. But I would just share, when we talk about homelessness, and our bridge shelters now is a model, is a laboratory for being able to really get some real-time data now that we didn't have before. Close to 50% of mental health or substance abuse issues that are in there, and so that's the type of when it comes to the whole issue of behavioral health, that is, I think, the next challenge that all of us are trying to work in a much more urgent way, particularly, again, with our counties, to have those discussions.
And do you have any idea, ballpark number, how many people in San Diego might be
I don't
served?
at this time.
Okay.
But again, back to why we're trying to, for the first time ever, and have everybody on the same system, sharing the same information, the data, so we can have some real information.
So as we get toward the end of the conversation, I want to look ahead at the next couple years. Mayor Garcetti, your constituents, have given you billions of dollars to alleviate homelessness, and I'm just wondering whether your ability to, solve this issue in your city factors into your decision of whether to run for president.
No, not at all. But thank you for bringing those together.
That question for all of us, or just for Mayor Garcetti?
If Steinberg runs, I think that's much more influential on me, and I'd be happy to serve with Darrell if the Constitution didn't prohibit it. But no, this predates and will long post-date any of that decision. One thing I will say is this better be a national conversation soon, too. It's one thing that we've elevated this up to the state level, but if one of us were president, or a mayor were president, or somebody struggling with this were president, this would be a priority in this country. If 10 of us had a broken leg and we went to an emergency room, we would all get help. But if 10 of us are addicted to opioids or dealing with mental health issue and we go to the emergency room, I bet not even one of us will get into a program that day. So absolutely, this is a national conversation, one that I welcome when people say, oh my gosh, how could you even think about running when these things are happening here? Go to Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, where it's higher per capita than us. That's in the back yard of the White House. If we don't elevate this up in Congress and our president and others take this seriously, again, you'll keep asking those numerical questions. We can't answer them. We can say we're going to do better and better each year. We're adding more and more dollars each year. But don't require the mayors of this country to be the cleanup crew for a collective national failure to deal with the sources of why these things happen.
So would it be unfair in a hypothetical presidential campaign that people kind of held you accountable on this issue?
We're held accountable for everything we do, and I own that always. So, of course, that would come up.
Okay.
But I'd leave it to reporters to decide at the next panel.
Noted. And as Gavin Newsom,
we'll call him Gavin Governor. Yeah. So, Gavin Governor.
As he campaigned for governor, he talked a lot about the need for more affordable housing and more leadership from the state on homelessness. He's mentioned the possibility of bringing back redevelopment agencies that helped fund low-income housing, creating a cabinet-level position to address homelessness statewide, and he's called for a regional planning type approach to homelessness to encourage more cooperation between cities and counties, something several of you have mentioned. But fundamentally, this is a local problem. You guys are in charge. And I'm just wondering, do you want the state to stay out of it, or is there a policy that the state could help you with?
No. Let me jump in.
Okay.
Go ahead. We want, yes.
Stay away from this problem. Please, leave us alone.
This is a statewide issue. And again, back to the urgency. And everybody here on the stage engaged on the local level. But when we look at some of the, what are some of the issues that we can be dealing with right now on the statewide level, to answer your question directly, and I got to this earlier, we have to reestablish tax increment that was the number one source.
Also known as redevelopment?
Redevelopment for affordable housing in California.
I didn't do it, by the way.
No, but we're united on moving forward on that. That went away, was it 6 years ago now? In the case of San Diego, that's close to $300 million that we could be using for affordable housing that we don't have. And another, back to as the governor is putting his checklist together, which is an important issue. Absolutely, the state and the legislature should be jumping in. And I have to stress again, CEQA reform has to be at the top of that list, ladies and gentlemen. We have to have the ability to get projects through the system without having to wait for years to build them.
Okay, I can see Mayor Steinberg is itching to jump in on this
I just
one.
think one of the very hopeful things is that Governor-elect Newsom is going to make this a top 2 or 3 priority. He's been very clear about
Very
it.
exciting.
Yes.
As a former mayor, and he knows that this is a key statewide issue, and it is more flexible funding for the kinds of things that the cities are championing that we've talked about here today. We got a down payment last year with $500 million. We'd like to make that, ongoing in some way and even elevated. But it's also some of these thank you. It's also these regulatory.
Just try to lead that crowd clap so that
It's also the regulatory issues around to make it easier to cite, to be able to build, and finally, I'm going to go back to what Libby said and Eric. There must be a statewide strategy and funded approach to prevention and early intervention. Not just, by the way, for people who are living on the edge, but for the teenagers who are showing early signs of psychosis and the mental health issue, the key paradigm shift in mental health, and I spent a lifetime in this particular field, is changing this system from a stage 4 system where you only get help, if at all, when you fail, to a stage 1 system where we help people when they begin to show the signs, because that ultimately is what is going to prevent much of the next generation of people who are going to end up in our jails and on our streets.
What about you, Mayor Schaaf? Other than money, are there policy changes from the state level that you'd like to see?
Yeah, I mean, we need full-scale system change. I just always get back to how my day started the day before yesterday. I had an officer respond to a 911 call. People heard screams. He discovered a woman who was living in her car who just gave birth to a baby by herself. Her baby was unresponsive. The good news is that the officer actually saved the life of the baby. But has anyone here given birth to a baby or watched a woman give birth to a baby? Can you imagine that we, in the wealthiest region, in the wealthiest state, in the wealthiest nation, are tolerating that as a reality? That is fundamentally wrong. And we can talk all day about funding and policy for our endless cycle of triage, getting people off the street and into safety and services, getting them into rapid rehousing, building more permanent supportive housing, preventing homelessness to begin with. But what the fuck? Sorry. This is a fundamentally broken system that needs to be reimagined from the get-go. So obviously I have very strong feelings about this.
As you should.
So I just hope that we don't keep on tweaking this cycle that we have become complacent with.
Amen.
That we, in this great nation, state, set of cities, say that this is not tolerable. And that we envision a whole different system.
And is that like completely revisioning a system something you can imagine coming out of the state capitol?
You know, I have to say that I am full of hope that there is more political will, more political courage than we have ever seen in California at this moment. And so I am actually very hopeful. I mean, you saw the bipartisan alignment of mayors, regardless of party, how we've worked together. We have a governor who ran on the concept of courage, on bold ideas, on re-envisioning how government works. And I actually have hope in this moment. I do.
Okay.
It was January this year that we were in Washington, D.C. for the U.S. Conference of Mayors. I was handing the gavel over to Darrell for the Big 11. And it was what Kevin's words said today. Here was a Republican from Southern California. We had Lee Brand, I think, Republican from cheaper housing, Fresno, Central Valley. It was Libby, myself, Robert Garcia from Long Beach. And one by one, we went through and we said, this is the biggest issue in our city. It cut across demography, geography, party. And if in 1 year, what's the last time in Sacramento, something that had no funding stream, no proposed legislation, went from a conversation in January to $500 million, where I had a check in my hand for $85 million. You still got a paper check from the state of California. We got to talk to them about that. A week and a half ago, you got your check, and we spent $3 million of it the next day. So is there the will there? Absolutely, because any caring Californian knows this is not an issue. It is the issue, and it is everywhere in our state. And I'm so excited a governor is running on this, has been elected on this, has experience with this, a legislature that is ready to jump in and are falling over themselves to sponsor things. And we've got, I wrote down 8 things that we've talked about that's already a state agenda. And that's after we're doing our local stuff. We're not saying save us. We've already been trying to save ourselves, but we're sick of pulling people out of the river without figuring out why they're falling in.
Great. This is your last opportunity to pass up your questions. We have people coming down the aisles with collection baskets there for the questions. And in the meantime, I'm going to start
It's public radio, so you'll edit that out, right?
Sorry.
I'm going to start with a question we got on social media before the event started, which is timely. It's about the campfire, the one that's burning up in Chico, Butte County. it's displaced thousands of people, obviously, and will strain neighboring cities and counties. And our reader, whose name is Tim, is asking how mayors are planning for this sort of new normal of these kind of natural disasters that have this ripple effect on shelter in neighboring communities.
Well, we have to first of all, we have to maximize the use of our public facilities for emergency shelter. We're a home to the state fairgrounds. CalExpo, it once housed the what we call the winter shelter, and no longer does. And so we're in conversation with our state fairground leaders and the governor's office about how we use our large public facilities to be able to house people, not only in emergency situations, but as part of our neighborhood-based triage strategy throughout Sacramento. We have to maximize what we have and utilize it rapidly.
In Oakland, the thing I am most excited about is an effort called CASA, the Committee to House the Bay Area. And this idea that we have to not think city by city by city, but recognize the interdependence that we have as a whole region, I think is one of the most important ideas that we all need to embrace. And so CASA is looking at a very bold agenda, both policy as well as revenue, that would protect renters, would preserve existing affordable housing, and would produce a lot more housing at every income level to meet the need of everyone in the Bay Area. And so this recognition that we have to see ourselves as interdependent, I think, is the kind of thing that will make us resilient and able to respond when you have these displacement events. And I mean, the fire is a very tangible displacement event, but I give the example of Cupertino approving a new Apple headquarters and inviting 11,000 workers to drive into their city every day. And that same year that they opened that headquarters, they approved permits for only 27 new units of housing. So that's another kind of displacement emergency that is not quite as dramatic, but is also important and recognizes our interdependence.
Great point. Thank you. Mayor Garcetti, thanks.
Well, it's interesting. One of the issues I was thinking about while Libby was talking was that Prop 10 failed. If local government isn't empowered to make certain decisions to help stop that displacement and to be able to address rents, then it's on Sacramento, because Sacramento can do that in the legislature. And I think that this is a great moment. The things that aren't going to kill off a housing market aren't going to be part of all the kind of scare tactics of Prop 10. But we do pay the costs of, housing that goes up 25, 50, 100% in rents in a single year. We all do. We might make way for beautiful new things and luxury housing, but we all pay a very expensive price, and then people want us to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to solve homelessness as a result of the inaction of us being able to preserve renters where they are. And that's a huge, huge piece of this, and I think we need to be able to talk about that. But in terms of the fire question, we have mostly in our city right now folks from other cities because of the Woolsey fire in Los Angeles. I went to those places in our community colleges and our high schools, and it was, if you ever feel, somebody asked how I was feeling the other day, and I said, I feel broken and I feel strong. And I was kind of surprised that I said both of those words. I feel broken because after African Americans being hunted down and killed, and 11 Jewish Americans being hunted down and killed, and then what happened, the elections, and then the next day there were 12 people shot in the 307th mass shooting in this country in Thousand Oaks, and then the fires broke out the next minute. It's like tough not to feel broken. Yeah. But when you go into a shelter and you see people who have been there without sleeping for hours, a volleyball team who shows up at Pierce College, community college for practice, realizes there's no practice, and then just gets to work helping neighbors, and the piles of clothes that come in and the food, like there is a human heart that is big. What's tough about folks that are experiencing homelessness is it's not a big burn, it's a slow, smoldering fire. And if we don't talk about the issues that drive that, whether it's rent, whether it's in the fact that in downtown Los Angeles and in Skid Row, 70% of the folks that are there are African American. We have a whole committee looking at black homelessness at the Homeless Services Authority to understand youth homelessness, LGBTQ community who come to places where they look to have freedom but find themselves on the streets. We have to, I think, really have all hands on what is a smoldering fire and what is our commitment to each other. I think that it is there. If we can prove it in moments of fires, we can absolutely prove it in moments where it lasts many more days than that.
We've got a bunch of great questions from the audience here in the room. So I'll read some of the questions, and if you feel compelled to answer it, jump in. Maybe we don't need to hear from everyone on all of them, but this question says approximately 40% of houseless youth are LGBTQ. Are any of your cities offering specific assistance to this vulnerable group?
Yes, I'll just finish where I stepped up before. Yes, we are. We're building specific sites, and we need more beds for the trans community because inevitably in shelter environment, trans community, it's really tough. If it's trans women, non-trans women often will make life very difficult. We need dedicated trans spaces too.
Anyone else want to add anything? No, okay. This question says, I can appreciate that you all hail from the Big 11, but what are you hearing from your rural counterparts about their needs? Do you think a statewide solution or set of solutions could also embrace California's smaller rural towns and cities?
Yes, and of course, this is not just an urban problem, but it also speaks to the need for a more regional approach to how we go about solving the problem, because the smaller cities, the smaller counties often don't have the infrastructure to do this on their own, but with a regional approach, they have more of that ability, I think, to help folks. But this is no longer just an urban problem.
This question is specific to San Diego.
Want to take this one, Kevin?
Yeah,
I got it.
How were landlords contacted and mobilized to support and provide housing to the veterans?
Yeah, great question. Brought some of them in, and we did it in coordination with the Chamber of Commerce and invited them around a big table, some of the biggest landlords in the city. I said, I need your help. I need you to do the right thing. As I said earlier, we're gonna help you out financially to give you some of those guarantees. But I had people sitting around the table, and I looked them in the eye. And I said, this is how you can help your city. We're going to do a program that it's going to work to take some of the financial risk away from it. But if you give it a chance, I think you're going to like it. So far with the veterans program, it has absolutely worked. And now the challenge is to expand that beyond veterans to all of the programs that we're trying to do. And again, partly why all of these dollars, and even if it's gap financing, it can make a huge difference from being able, or a voucher, to be able to afford an apartment or not. I've usually found that when you bring people in and you actually talk to them, you can take away some of the fears, or you can say, here's what's going to happen, here's what we're going to do it. Try it. Don't be afraid to jump in with both feet. And if it doesn't work, let's do something else. But again, inaction is not going to help any of us. So to answer that question directly, bringing people in and saying,
Great.
I need your help.
Thank you. Have your cities looked internationally for models to amend homelessness?
Well, I will say I have my conference call with the special I think you say reporter. Yo hablo español, no francés. Okay. From the United Nations. And I read her report on on homelessness in general, but really calling out the Bay Area. And I think to some extent Los Angeles. And so I am looking forward to picking her brain. I know we've looked at, for example, IKEA tents, although some of those don't meet our fire codes. So we have been trying to look at those models to take what we can from them. Absolutely.
Yes, I've had discussions with Mayor Hidalgo of Paris. They have 1,000 people encamped in one encampment in Paris. There, it's a refugee problem. There's really no well-developed, rich country that has what we have. There are refugee issues that they have, which are oftentimes much better organized, but their homelessness problem in Paris is mostly refugees who leave camps or whatever and then encamp there. And so we've talked about things. We talked about the, what do you do as San Francisco went through for folks who are experiencing drug addiction. for safe injection sites and things like that. So there's a little bit of an international conversation, but we don't have many peers.
The person who wrote the question mentions that Hamburg in Germany has a model eviction prevention program that could help in California cities.
Great.
That sounds maybe a little bit
Thanks
like
for the tip.
what you were
Okay.
talking about. Couple state policy questions here. Senator Scott Wiener from San Francisco had this really controversial proposal earlier this year. Didn't get very far in the legislature, but it would have required local governments to approve denser housing near transit in a way that really would overhaul the traditional sort of lines of authority and take away some local control that is the norm in our system. And so this audience member is asking, do you see policies like this bill, Senate Bill 827, as part of the solution?
Yes. I mean, I've supported it the first time. But I will say that if the legislature doesn't have the appetite for it statewide, again, we have this strategy to ask for a set of policies that might only apply to the Bay Area. Because we do think that there's support from our legislative delegation for these more aggressive things. And for example, I mean, since it seems like rent control seems to give people pause, we are declaring that we have a housing emergency and that we are going to talk about anti-rent gouging regulations to apply to the whole Bay Area for at least 15 years.
Yep.
Again, this is a crisis.
I'd like to comment on this local control issue for a moment because it tends to be one of those issues that artificially divides, right? And I always say my constituents are the same as Kevin McCarty's and Richard Pan's, right? When I was in the legislature, my constituents were the same as Kevin Johnson's. It doesn't matter. We all have different responsibilities, and local control is an important principle, but it might surprise you that I would say this as a mayor. I think it's highly overrated.
I agree with you.
I do.
It's local control
it's local
and regional responsibility.
Local control to what end? Are we solving the housing supply crisis in the city? Are the stories like the one Mayor Schaaf just talked about, Cupertino, an anomaly? I don't think so. Where state policy pushes local government, but more importantly society, to meet a crucial quality of life imperative, then the state policy should outweigh the local control. And, I'm just tired of the us versus them. It's not getting us anywhere, right? And that's why I appreciate what Senator Wiener has tried to do. I expect to see more of those efforts. It ought to be done with collaboration and negotiation with local government partners, absolutely. They're not always right. I was there. They're not always right.
You were always right, but they're not.
Yeah, I was. But there's no question that this issue of local control it's not in the Bible.
Well, and local isn't local anymore. I mean, this just came out that more than 100,000 of Darrell's residents are driving through all sorts of cities to come to work in my region. More than 100,000 Sacramentans. Is that how you call yourself?
Sacramentans. We're changing that because we're building industry here, clean industry in Sacramento.
But right now, they're driving through all your other locally controlled cities to get to my locally controlled city.
Only been mayor for 2 years.
What is local?
And I know you have a bunch of questions, but this is a really important one to stop on for a moment, because I told Senator Wiener that do work with us more closely. Because I think there should be real punishments for cities who really don't build anything. But for those, for instance, we have a great success story. Maybe it's a template for what he could help pass here. We did a transit-oriented communities, transit-oriented development, as people know it, law in the city of Los Angeles as the result of a voter-approved measure a couple years ago on housing. And it gave the mayor the power to actually determine zoning, height, density near transit. It wasn't as vague a definition as his bill was, which was that like whenever any bus stopped, at least every 15 minutes, it was basically the entire city of LA would have just gone like no zoning anymore. So that's why we weren't in favor. It wasn't nuanced at all for our geography. But what we've done in 1 year of having this thing that allows you to go much higher, and they gave me a baby bear, mama bear, and papa bear version, thinking, he's a politician, he might go for one of the first two. We went above the papa bear version. We said go way up because we're seeing all these millennials and others who are not working for a developer, who are not ginned up by City Hall, turning out to public meetings now saying, densify the city. I want to have something I can afford. And if people are willing on their own dime with no subsidy to build very low income, very low income or extremely low income, and everybody who does this knows these units never get built by anybody, they can go higher and higher and higher. 10,000 units in the first 10 months, I think, of this, almost 2,000 of them with no public subsidy, affordable, and a third of those extremely low income. So there is something to helping, like, look, if you don't meet your goals, this kind of an envelope comes over your city because Cupertino needs to build more than 27 new units. But listen to the cities is my advice for Senator Wiener. Work with us at the beginning, and absolutely, let's get something done, because I hate pulling my weight only to know sometimes there's a neighbor next door who's living off of that like a barnacle.
Let me just jump on. Transit-oriented development is where you want the density. I mean, that's when we think about cities and those cities that are successful, and again, back to trying to provide housing that people can actually afford, we need to do that around transit corridors. Back to why I'm spending so much time in San Diego updating some of our community plans, which haven't been updated in some cases in 25 or 30 years, and tying those to master EIRs. Is so he said, let's have that conversation now, and let's actually increase the amount that you're able to do so you don't have to have those types of discussions on every single one-off project that stops it and takes so much time. We also just last week, again, back on transit-oriented districts, I'm going to dramatically slash the parking requirements. Why should you have so much parking requirements that adds tremendous cost to units? A lot of the folks aren't going to use them. And so again, it's trying to be creative. It's trying to say, look, here's where today's housing is, and the types of folks that we want to do. And around transit areas, that's absolutely the future and where you want that density and our best opportunity to make some of these units affordable.
And Mayor, I'll say it works. We did area-specific plans a few years ago. We eliminated parking requirements in our downtown, and we have the biggest building boom Oakland has seen since the 1906 earthquake. I have more than 8,600 units under construction right now, and that same amount in the development pipeline.
One of the huge reasons that bill failed was the local control issue, and we have 4 mayors here sitting and saying,
but it wasn't just control.
I want it.
Control.
So, I'm sorry?
We weren't for it. It wasn't control in an abstract sense. I think it was.
They don't want change. They won't.
There were some who didn't want that philosophically. Some of us aren't against it philosophically. It's just work with us, because if you come in with we're taking it away and we're not looking at what you're doing at all, that's not a good way to approach it.
So it's not that it was not your cities and other local governments, or you're just saying.
I think
the third time will be a charm. I think he'll get it done this time.
The best policy is the combination of the carrot and the stick, right?
Yep,
where you provide the incentives to create more production. By the way, the whole state housing policy is focused on planning, not much on production.
Yeah,
planning is a prerequisite to production. But to me, if you're producing, then the state ought not to get in your business.
Exactly.
But if you're not producing, then I think that the state has every right to, and that overrides this concept of local control.
We have another statewide policy question here about rent control, with Prop 10 failing drastically in the election this month. The question is, how can the legislature reframe the need for rent control? Is this the right time to stay focused on it still? Do you think that it's something the legislature can do? Or
they almost had a deal,
and
they should go back to that. Even though the folks who won might say, we don't have to now, it is still absolutely a problem. And the state legislature, which has the power to force the question again, it is not going to be good enough to just say, well, the voters spoke. We have a problem we have to confront. I like what Darrell talked about. I mean, I think there is the ability to say something, or maybe it was Libby in the Bay Area, why not statewide? There shouldn't be increases that are outrageous in the midst of a homelessness crisis.
Yeah. So
we
maybe
have to have some limit on that.
It's an emergency. Just like when there's a fire, you pass an anti-rent gouging ordinance. The state has had a fire. It's called a housing crisis.
Yes.
So would that mean a repeal of Costa-Hawkins or something else?
No, they don't have to. Costa-Hawkins only applies to us. They can today do whatever rent control for the state they'd want.
Yep.
They've retained that power, so now they have to use it.
The concept of rent gouging is there's already precedent in state laws, Libby said, and it could apply more broadly. I don't think rent control as a state policy is the right thing, because I think we want to induce more supply. Yep. But that's different from dealing with a state of emergency, lower to middle income folks, means testing, and making sure you really protect people who are going to end up in our shelters and on our streets if we don't have a variety of approaches to helping them.
And how we define what is new construction. It might have made sense when Costa-Hawkins passed to have a set year, but as that year gets farther and farther away, it makes less sense.
Right.
So rather than a year, it might be housing that's 20 years old or something like that. Okay, great. Well, I think that is going to conclude. I want to thank the mayors for the really interesting conversation. Thank you so much, and thank all of you for coming. And I think that wraps it up.
Thank
All
you.
right, thank you,
all
everybody.
for coming.
Yeah,
Appreciate it.
Thank you.